Well, thank you very much, Deacon, for the long introduction. But, grateful for that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody who's come along. And it's nice to see quite a mix this evening because I know that the Worshipful Company of Engineers also publicised the event tonight, and so we're having a London-Glasgow collaboration going on in the background. And Deacon convener Ken Dalgleish and collector Billy Burr-Stewart of the Trades House of Glasgow are with us in the room tonight, so I'm sure they'll be pleased to see these links with the livery of London. Tonight is about giving you a bit of an insight into the calibre and the eminence of some of the Hammermen of Glasgow between roughly 1815, Battle of Waterloo, and 1914, the start of the First World War. Referring to the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame and inductees that have been Hammermen, and a really excellent history of the Hammermen, Lumsden and Aitkins, touch on connections with the Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland at that time, and then a particular look at how the Hammermen reinvented themselves after the Borough Reform Act of 1846, and a bit at the end about the good, the bad, and the downright hairy about Scottish networking and patronage at that time. So here's my period. It's a 99-year period when Glasgow's population increased from about 140,000 to over 1 million. Some of that growth in the latter stages was by incorporating Govan and the south side, but mostly it was immigration and longer life expectancy as improvements to health were engineered for the systems of clean water supply and sanitation. And Glasgow in that period became one of the major engineering workshops of the world. In 1835, for example, the Clyde still produced only about 5% of UK shipping. By 1914, it was building more than half. And the combination of commercial and naval orders was a generally increasing demand, particularly as the race to build dreadnoughts and battleships was at full pelt prior to World War I. The Glasgow exhibition, middle image there, was one of the high points of that period and really nailed Glasgow's colour to the mast as the second city of the empire. And it was a city that had been built on steel, ships, locomotives, and engineering. The ships and the locomotives, they needed engines, they needed boilers, they needed fixtures, they needed fittings. So the supply chains feeding the big shipyards and the big engineering works also clustered around Glasgow, requiring skilled tradesmen and allowing young entrepreneurs to start up their own businesses. By 1871, there were more people employed in heavy industry in Strathclyde area than in textiles. And that was the flip over year, because up till then, textiles had been the largest employment area for about 100 years prior. And the same period, of course, saw the phenomenal growth of the railway network. From 1830, when the Liverpool-Manchester Railway proved the concept, the Glasgow-Edinburgh Railway opened in 1842, just 12 years later. And Glasgow's access to cheaper iron, and then after the 1880s, steel production through its apparently at that time unlimited coal and ironstone supplies, was also helped and improved by technology improvements from individuals of individual genius, as we'll hear later. And industrialisation, of course, wasn't just restricted to the UK. Britain's empire was a huge market for railway products, machinery, iron and steel cranes, steam hammers, pipes, bridges, machinery, locomotives, all of which were produced in Glasgow and the Clyde, exported to India, Australia, Africa, Canada, the West Indies, Egypt, South America. Argentina was almost part of the informal British Empire for a while. And it wasn't just about iron and steel. Tennant's Chemical Works, J&P Coates, Worldwide Empire, coal mining itself, and then all of the service industries that underpinned those, the banking, the financial, the trading, and the legal expertise to allow the capital to flow, to bankroll the leading industrialists, to keep their enterprises invested and growing. Those also clustered around industrial Clydeside. So where did the Glasgow Incorporation of Hammermen and Trades House fit into all of this? And who were the Hammerman that helped create the industrial powerhouse that was Glasgow and the Clyde in that period. And in 20 minutes, I can give you a few insights to a few individuals and then reflect on how they operated, speculate on what being a Hammerman might have meant in that time. And my starting point, of course, for eminent Hammermen is the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame. And there we find 3 inductees of interest in the period who were Hammermen. Robert Napier, the father of Clyde Shipbuilding. He actually took 2 attempts to get into the Hammerman, not because his first essay, as everyone had to do at that time, not because the first one failed, but because he couldn't produce his Burgess ticket. So he came back a year later in 1815 with another essay, actually, aboard Hammer, and was admitted Hammerman at that time. Became then a very young deacon in 1820, that would make him 29. And progressively, business expanded from marine engines initially through to building what was the largest ship in the world at the time, the RMS Persia in 1855. And then not that long after that, he built in Napier's yard HMS Black Prince for the Admiralty, which was the largest ever built on the Clyde up to that time. Not by then the world's largest, and that's because Brunel's and Scott Russell's Great Eastern had been launched between the Persia and the Black Prince. So there's RMS Persia, launched 1855, steam and sail powered, built for Cunard, the start of a very long relationship with Napier's. And on the right, Napier's home in Gairloch gives an inkling of his success, as does that middle image of 4 past presidents of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, Penn, Whitworth, Napier, and William Fairbairn. The next Hall of Fame Hammerman inductee is 50 years on from Robert Napier's time, Sir William Aryl, the man of steel. Born in Houston, Renfrewshire, it's only about a mile from where I live now, trained as a blacksmith, but the need to be a hammerman to trade as a blacksmith or a smith of any kind was abolished in 1846. So Aryl didn't have to become a hammerman, not even a Paisley hammerman, but his success with hydraulic riveting, automated drilling, many other innovations quickly led him to be the greatest steel fabricator that we have seen in Scotland and of worldwide impact. Whether it was bridges, cranes, much more were exported worldwide from Dalmarnock. And he became a Glasgow hammerman in later life at the age of 67, collected by Hugh Reid in 1906, and we'll come on to him later, along with most of the Aryl family of engineers. So there was clearly a very close business connection between the collector of the Hammermen of 1906 and the Aryl dynasty of engineers. Aryl had also served as president of the Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland, IESIS, when he was 56, and also MP for South Ayrshire. 3 of his most iconic bridges were underway at the same time. He had a weekly work pattern whilst these 3 bridges were being built of spending Monday mornings at Dalmarnock in East Glasgow, train to South Queensferry for Forth Bridge meetings and oversight, train upwards to Dundee on the Tuesday evening, Wednesday at Dundee for meetings, back to Glasgow, and then he repeated the same cycle, except when it got to Friday night, he took the sleeper to London for a progress meeting on Tower Bridge on the Saturday morning, and then back to Glasgow on Sunday, and then that repeated again. Huge energy in the man. He also later funded the Aryl Johnson automobile business. The 3rd Engineering Hall of Fame hammerman is Henry Dyer, not so well known maybe, an academic, became highly revered in Japan after serving as the first principal of the Imperial College of Engineering from the age of 25 up until he was 33. And that was the critical period in Japan as it opened up to the West under the Meiji. He became a hammerman at the age of 42 after he'd returned to Scotland And his name survives in a building at Strathclyde University. And Tokyo University still has a bronze bust of Dyer in the reception area of was the Imperial College, now Tokyo University. And I've visited that when I was in Tokyo. My next port of call for eminent engineers is the history of the Hammermen, Lumsden and Aitkins' mighty tome. And we're really lucky to have this historical book. And in it, there are 2 pages actually with images of who in 1912 they deemed to be their well-known hammermen. Many of them are engineers. Robert Napier, William Smith was the W of A&W Smith, sugar machinery manufacturers, eventually incorporated into Tate & Lyle's corporation many years later. Third name is Archibald Gilchrist. He was chairman of Barclay Curle Shipbuilders, as was his son James and his grandson Archibald at different times. All of them Hammermen. Now, the next 3 are all connected. James Beaumont Nielsen admitted to the Hammermen when the essay was still required, and a year later he lodged his patent for the hot blast process to reduce the cost of making iron by about 32 shillings per tonne. Significant saving, and for which, under the terms of the patent and the royalties, he received a shilling per tonne. And the hot blast process gave Scottish iron masters a huge competitive advantage for a period of time. In 1830, Scotland had 27 iron furnaces. By 1860, it had 171. Pig iron produced in Scotland peaked at 1.2 million tonnes in 1869. But the iron masters were contumacious, and they still didn't like to pay royalties, and they challenged the patents. A group of them got together. Beaumont Nielsen defended them, took quite a bit of effort, but succeeded, and the iron masters had to continue to pay for the duration of the patent. Nielsen died a very rich man in his estate in Kirkcudbright at Queen's Hill. Interestingly named Queen's Hill after Mary Queen of Scots, who allegedly rested there after fleeing from the Battle of Langside, pursued perhaps by hammermen who are known to have fought there. The Langside banner survives today. One of his sons, Walter Montgomery Nielsen, trained initially in his uncle John's engine works, and by the age of 28 was running his own locomotive engineering business, Nielsen and Company. We tend to assume these old Victorian great industrialists were old, because that's when we see their images reproduced. This one's from the Bailey magazine, which has many famous Glaswegians. But actually, they were young Turks. Walter Nielsen, with the aid of the capital from his father, was running his own business at the age of 28. And they employed James Reid as works manager. But 6 years or 7 years later, wanted a more experienced locomotive man, and they hired Henry Dubbs. And Reid departed at that time to a rival locomotive builder in Manchester, Sharp Stewart and Company. Now, 6 years after that, Henry Dubbs set up on his own in Glasgow. That triggered Reid coming back to manage the Nielsen business. And a few years after that, later exercised a right in his contract to buy out Nielsen and Company. And that might have instigated a bit of bad feeling, because Walter Montgomery Nielsen himself retired almost immediately. But then a few years later, he started up the Clyde Locomotive Works almost next door to the Nielsen works. But Walter Nielsen was probably getting on a bit in years at that time. It didn't really succeed. It only built about a dozen or so locomotives, ended up selling it to Sharp Stewart and Company of Manchester, who Reid used to work for. So a very incestuous collection of companies and individuals involved with them. Surprise, surprise, 1903, they all came together as the North British Locomotive Company. And all of them were hammermen: Dubbs, Reid, Nielsen. Here is James Reid, another fine beard. And you can see the interwoven links there with Walter Nielsen and his life history and his personal relationships, including naming one of his sons after him, because Walter Montgomery Nielsen Reid. So if they did fall out, as I think they did in later life, it must have been quite a painful period between the Nielsen's and the Reid families. James Reid also became a president of IESIS some years after Walter Montgomery Nielsen. And his eldest son, Hugh Reid, succeeded him as managing director of Nielsen Reid and Company, as it was by then. And when the North British Locomotive Company was formed, he became chief managing director of that. And he went on to be the Deacon of the Hammermen and indeed Lord Dean of Guild of Glasgow, and created a baronet at the age of 62. And the baronetcy survived 3 generations before it died out due to no further issue. My final pen sketch of eminent Hammerman is Anthony Ingalls, formed with his brother A&J Ingalls, initially building marine engines, was Deacon of the Hammermen, also Deacon Convener of the Trades House, and they acquired the Point House yard where the Kelvin meets the Clyde, which became one of the great Clyde shipyards. And most of these great engineers and businessmen operated in different intersecting networks. And another of those that we've mentioned a few times is the engineers and shipbuilders in Scotland. And that was an important one in Glasgow from 1857 when it was founded by Rankin. And I started preparing for tonight looking at those presidents of IESIS who were also Hammermen, but it's almost all of them, except Rankin himself, who I couldn't find as having been entered into the Hammermen. So I concentrated therefore on those presidents of IESIS who've also served as Deacon of the Hammermen, which is a shorter list. And as you can see there, we've got 9 so far, but there is one more on the way with David Westmore. Of those names on this list, James Lennox Kincaid Jameson, a splendid name, isn't it? He was chief engineer of Elders and Company on the site of what is now Govan Shipbuilders, and Elders became Fairfields. And then you see James Gilchrist, two down from it, Archibald Gilchrist. They're the second and the third generation of Gilchrists that became chairman of Barclaycall Shipbuilders. Sandwiching Howden Hume of James Howden and Company. And then Harold Edgar Yarrow served twice as president of IESIS, quite a gap between them. Yarrows had brought their business up from London and the Thames to the Clyde and became one of the major naval shipbuilders. And then you see 2 of the Stephens of Linthouse, with Sandy Stephen being the most recent. And it's good to see the links continuing. So what was it about the Hammermen that channeled these successful engineers into their ranks? After Napier and Nielsen, it wasn't necessary to get the approval of the craft to practice as smiths. Privileges for that were abolished in 1846 in the Borough Reform Act. And quite quickly, the Hammermen responded to that, firstly by raising their fees and abolishing the need for the essay because it became nugatory. They were, right at that point, reinventing themselves, as were all of the Glasgow crafts as part of the Trades House. And indeed, the demise of the crafts at that time was widely predicted before the Borough Reform Act removed their ancient privileges. But they were made of sterner stuff. And I think their appeal that the Hammermen created and other crafts was the eminence of the networking opportunities that they offered. If you wanted to bump into Napiers, Nielsen's, Reid's, tenants, shipyard owners, captains of industry, you joined the Hammermen. And that latter part of the 19th century, far from being the demise of the Hammermen, it was actually a boom time for Glasgow, and it was a boom time for Hammermen. New recruits in a year sometimes exceeded 100, and that resulted in their finances similarly prospering, allowing them to be almost 10 times more philanthropic in 1900 than they had been in 1846. And that's in real terms, today's value of over £5 million at the turn of the century. Different story in the 20th century, by the way, because of rampant inflation and the times of war and of the need for benevolence, perhaps, induced by that. So the networking circles in which this huge array of engineering activity operated at the time most definitely included the Hammermen, despite the existential threat of 1846 of the removal of the ancient privileges. And of course, in that time, it wasn't the only business network that engineers and industrialists would join. IESIS is another important one too, and that would offer maybe more frequent opportunities to meet. But the Hammermen, after 1846, as purely a charitable body, could perhaps salve the consciences of those who supported the ideal of benevolence and philanthropy. IESIS could lead on sharing the advancement of engineering knowledge, but the links to Tradeshouse would appeal to those who also believed in civic duty and took pride in Glasgow's civic development and ambitions. And many went on to become deacon conveners. The Hammermen provided 7 deacon conveners between 1857 and 1897, a 40-year period, and that's more than double the expectation if averaged across the 14 crafts. One can only speculate about what deals were done or acquisitions were made or friendships struck or even rivalries inflamed when they met at the Hammerman annual dinner. It's impossible to presume that it helped oil the wheels of industry, or indeed whether dark deals were struck to avoid competition laws or fix wages or fight unions, or whether alliances were formed to lobby governments to protect their markets. All of that is possible, but not robustly provable. But we do know that these business and engineering leaders, they had the opportunity to meet as Hammermen. And if the Scottish trait is representative, they were probably clannish in their dealings, as long as there was mutual benefit. If, for example, there were several options for a new business deal, being a fellow Hammerman might have given the seller the edge required. Not unlike the business networks that would form around the edges of golf clubs or the church or temperance movements or Freemasonry. There would be a level of trust in fair dealings that was implied, and a common bond to which a stranger to that network couldn't aspire. And if darker dealings were afoot, they could and they would be up to such mischief in private anyway, whether they first met in a kirk session or a golf course. But as with any exclusive club, there could also have been an unconscious bias or even a conscious bias towards those who sought to join. And today's normal practice of openness and inclusivity weren't necessarily shared in the 19th century, especially where women were concerned. Another dark side is that the Hammerman was a male province, as were most business-related networks at that time, sadly. And the very existence of so many of these effectively contributed to suppressing equal opportunities for women. Women were neither welcomed nor wanted in these circles at the time. And the absence of comparable networks for women is part of why I think the Women's Engineering Society was formed in 1919 by women who'd earned huge respect as engineers, contributing to the war effort, like Dorothy Pullinger, pioneer automobile engineer who ran a huge workforce at Vickers during the war and is in the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame, thanks largely to Nina Baker. But yet the expectation, backed up by the law after the First World War, was that they had to give up their jobs to make way for returning servicemen. The other darker side of Glasgow's industrialisation was what we now know as the damage that was done to the environment. And it's fashionable to blame these burners of coal on an industrial scale for the evils of climate change. And it's undeniable that damage was done, of course, in that period. But at that time, aside from genuine concerns on clean air and clean water, in which big advances were made, there wasn't a conception of greenhouse gases and their impact on climate change. That knowledge came to light in our era, so we're responsible for the remedy. and it's unfair and unproductive to blame our predecessors. Coal at the time was regarded as a gift and a blessing, and its application took Glasgow and Scotland to quite undreamt of prosperity, which also improved the quality of life in many other areas. Scotland had the second highest GDP in the world in the early 20th century, second only marginally to England. Life expectancy steadily increased, infant mortality reduced, and municipal infrastructure for water supply, hospitals, schooling, public transport, parks, they were all paid for from the carboniferous capitalism of Glasgow and Clydeside. So it's quite nuanced and complex, and 19th century Glasgow industrialists may have been very focused on profits, they certainly were, but they didn't realise they were putting the planet at risk by consuming coal. So blame, I don't think, should be levelled at their door for that. It's an unfortunate and serious consequence of their actions, but it was unknown to them. We just have to deal with it. So the Glasgow Hammerman was one quite important, but not exclusive business and social network that was part of a complex interacting system. And its success is evidenced by its growth and its healthy patronage of very eminent people, creating a group of self-perpetuating role models that encouraged more to want to join that club, whether they wish to curry favour or secure patronage or rub shoulders with wealth, hoping that some of it might rub off. It doesn't really matter. They might have been also motivated entirely altruistically. And remember too that the church influence and belief was strong in all walks of life at the time. So the benevolence and the philanthropic duties of the Hammerman would ring home. We just need to acknowledge that the Hammerman brand was successful and it flourished mightily as part of the Trades House of Glasgow. And the success of Glasgow in that century, from a relatively modest township to becoming the second city of empire, was helped by the supporting organisational networks and circles in which the wealth creators operated. And in the world of engineering, shipbuilding, iron and steel, that most definitely included the Glasgow Hammerman. J.M. Barrie, in his play What Every Woman Knows, wrote, "There are few more impressive sights in the world than a Scotsman on the make." Now, he might well have been thinking about the archetypal member of the Glasgow Hammerman of the 19th century. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.